Hello everybody, welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me, whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording. Thank you for watching. Hello everybody, welcome to class today. Today we're going to talk about typography. I got a little to talk about, but then I also want to show you about how we can use type on the web with some different strategies. So we've got a lot to do today over the course of our hour. I have a fun little demo to do after we talk about typography to do for a few minutes. You come to think of it, it might not take the whole hour, because one of the things that I hope you all see by the time that we're done with this today is the fact that type is actually fairly simple. Right? So we're going to see some different ways that we can use it, as well as talk about it. So when we're talking about type, one of the first questions that we want to ask ourselves is, well, just what exactly is typography? And when we think about typography, one of the things that we're thinking about is, in general, we think about font, right? Like that's the thing that I think comes to everybody's mind when we say, or when we talk about typography, is just the idea of font. What is the font of the website? But really, when we get into typography and type pairings and working with type on the web, we find out that it's really a lot deeper than that. It's a lot more than that. Right? Because yes, it is how you choose to display your written content, but it's really the voice of your website. Right? And you can think about that like, kind of about how, in a similar way to the way that you think of your own voice. Right? Like, have you ever seen somebody who, when they opened their mouth to speak, their voice sounded completely different than what you were expecting? And so that's, one of the things that we could potentially do with type. And it's why we want to kind of pay attention to type as we're writing on a website, right? If we're writing something very serious, and we do it with a cutesy curly Q font, then we have a voice that doesn't match the appearance. Right? This also gets us into the idea that, all caps is like yelling. Right? Maybe that's something that you've heard before when you hear people talk about netiquette, or when you're hearing people, kind of discuss email etiquette or something like that. It's like, oh, don't type in all caps. All caps is like you're yelling. And again, what does that go back to? That goes back to the idea of voice. Right? So when we look at typography, it's much more than just font. It is font, spacing, readability, and usability. And as we'll talk about in just a few minutes, readability has two parts to it. And so if your type is bad, then your website's not going to be able to speak properly, basically, which makes your overall design bad, right? It impacts your overall design if you have bad type, because that's your communication mechanism, right? If you're delivering written content, that is, I guess I should say. If you're primarily focused on video content and you're less worried about type, then, you don't, it's a totally different thing there. And so as we kind of progress through today, we'll see that kind of type is more than just a group of beautiful letters. And so I want to start off talking about fonts here. My presentation is fairly short. We're going to roll through it pretty quickly. There are several different types of fonts that we have. Serif, sans serif, headline, calligraphic or handwritten, display fonts. These are all types of fonts. For the majority of times, we talk about serif versus sans serif fonts. Those are the two types of fonts that are in our web-safe fonts. So if we're dealing with serif fonts, they have serifs, right, which are those little pointy bits that stick off the edges, right? So if you think about things like or fonts like Times New Roman, for example. And you look at a T in Times New Roman. Right, you have your letter T, and then you have these little bits. You might even have them on the bottom there too, depending on the font. And so it's this little bit that is a serif. And so by default, right, serif fonts have these little bits. And these are really, really good for printed pieces. Right? The difference between print and digital is really the difference between our serif and our sans serif font readability. Right? Which is kind of strange if you sort of think about it, right? The fact that serif fonts, you know, if you get a book, for example, they're typically written with serif fonts. You open them up, you see a font that has these serifs, Times New Roman, or one of many others. But for the web, we go with the sans serif font, right? Fonts without these little bits. Arial, Helvetica, Roboto, Open Sans. Right, just a nice, clean, direct font. And so typically if we want to give off a professional appearance on the web, we're using some sort of straightforward, simple sans serif font. A headline font is a font that is bold, that really only works at like big letter sizes. Right, so when you think about a font like, say, Impact. Right, Impact are big, bold, chunky letters. And if we wrote an entire document with Impact, it's probably not going to look that great. It's probably going to be kind of difficult to read. But if we had a big, bold, large headline at the top of a page that was done in Impact font, then that's going to be something that can grab attention. And since it's big, it can be more easily read. And so we get these headline fonts that are good for headlines, good for big titles. Calligraphic or handwritten fonts, these are really popular nowadays. In fact, I think we're going to use one in an example. There is a font that is technically considered a calligraphic or handwritten font that is within the WebSafe fonts, and that is Comic Sans. Comic Sans is actually technically considered a handwritten font. And actually they say that if you're working with people with dyslexia, Comic Sans is actually the best font to use, which I find interesting. And I think that has a lot to do with its staying power, right? It's not just for, you know, people who want to write cute little emails, you know, to make it look cute. It actually has some accessibility reasons that we might use it. Although, you know, it is kind of incongruous with professional stuff, right? And so there are other fonts that have been designed for specialized use for people with dyslexia and other visual or writing processing disorders. And, you know, that's that could be another topic for another day. Maybe when we talk about accessibility in this course, we can talk about some of that stuff as well. And finally, display fonts. And these are kind of like fonts that you would see on a display. So we get like monotyped fonts in with a display font. In fact, you might see certain fonts, you know, you might see certain sites label them display fonts, certain sites will label them mono. You know, they'll just lump them all together in monotype fonts. right? A monotype font takes up the same amount of space for every letter. Think of a font like Courier. So it takes up one space for every letter. So if you think about how a display works, right, a segmented display, like there's a singular segment for one character that might be broken up into other pieces. Right, and so we get into the idea of display or monotype fonts there. We can see some examples. And there are tons of fonts, as we all know, right? Like if we look at just like a font sheet, we can just see how many different cues there could be. Right, like each of these cues that you see written here, each and every one of them are written differently. And each and every one of them convey a bit of a different emotion. Right, like if we see Amazon there versus the font to its right, Bitstream Cooper Light. We can see all of the extra flourish in the Amazon font versus just sort of the straightforward Bitstream Cooper Light Q there. You know, it's kind of like different accents. And, you know, with just a little bit of variation, we can look and say a lot of different stuff. And when we look at fonts, right, like by and large, we want to see how characters work together. And so you might see stuff like this, right? This is a character sheet for a font. And so if we look at our fonts, which we'll do in just a little bit, actually when you click to open a font on a Windows machine, you actually see something that looks kind of similar to this. So one of the things here we see is that we see all the glyphs together. But we also see some examples of writing so we can see how the font sort of works together. And this was a old school style type. When I say type here, I mean literally type book, right, for print setting. So we can see the font at different sizes. These may be different sizes that were sold as typeset pieces. Right, because nowadays we can see something from basically, 1 pixel all the way up to 1,000 pixels, and it's all fine. But this looks specifically at 72 point, 60 point, 48 point, 36 point, 24 point, 18 point, 12 point, 10 point, 8 point, and 6 point. This could be, I don't remember quite where this came from. This could be a digital font package. I want to say, however, it was a typesetting manual for a printing press. Because large format, like large scale printing was still done using a press until well into, using an old typeset press, I should say, until well into the 20th century. Nowadays, we typically use digital presses, which are more like, glorified printer copiers. But we see these sorts of things when we get fonts, right? So what is readability? That was the next thing on our list, readability. And readability we can define two ways. One is that if you're able to read the site. Right? Like think about our cues that we looked at back here again, and how elaborate some of these are. Right? Think about if every single letter on a page, and it was, hundreds or even thousands of characters, had all these elaborate flourishes. It'd make it a little bit difficult to read, right? Like just being able to parse the different characters to try to understand what was going on. Right, and so that's half of readability. The other half of readability is that you want to be able to read the site. Right? And I'm sure this is something that you all have faced as well, like as you all have been doing different things. Like think about going into an online course. What is more appealing to your eye visually? To make you say, oh, I want to look at that, or I want to get involved in that a little bit more. I want to actually read that. But if you just had a whole big wall of text that looked like the Declaration of Independence or something, or if you had maybe a little paragraph of text that was then broken up by an image and a video and another little paragraph of text that, was fairly large to read and, had enough line spacing to kind of give you some breathing room, and it just looked approachable, right? That sort of approachability that we get is what we're looking for there, right? The idea that text is approachable. So when we're talking about readability, we're talking about it twofold. We're talking about the fact that we want to read it, and the fact that we can read it, which are two different things, right? And so when we are talking about type on the web, some of the things, right, bigger is better. I like to go for at least 14-point or 16-point font. Typically that's going to be around, maybe 1.4, 1.6, 1.8 M. Just a little bit bigger than the standard, right? Because even people who have great vision don't necessarily want to squint to read text. Right? They don't necessarily want to have to struggle to read text. So you make it a little bit bigger. Don't cram your lines together. The longer your lines are, the more spacing you should put between your lines. There is a line spacing rule that we'll look at when we're doing our demonstration that just puts more spacing in between your lines. So the longer the line is, you want to have a little bit more visual separation between the lines so your user doesn't get lost. Make it attractive and readable. Consider your user. Think about what somebody might want to read. Think about how much somebody might want to read. Right? Is there a different way that we can convey some information? Maybe we, do a little paragraph, but instead of writing 3 other paragraphs, we make a video instead and put that video on there. And then the big thing, as we were talking about last week, is contrast. And I'm not just talking about contrast between the background color and the font color, but which I am, right? You want a high level of contrast, which is something that we'll talk about in even more depth when we get to the accessibility module in this course. But you also want contrast between different parts of your text, between your headings and your body copy, your paragraphs. Right? Because if it's hard to tell the two apart, it's hard to get a sense of the hierarchy of the document for the reader. Right? So we want to make sure that we have a headline font that is different from the paragraph font, and so on and so forth. Now, there are different ways that we can do this. We're going to do Google Web Fonts and self-hosted fonts today in our demonstration. There's also Typekit, which is a service that it costs money, but it it gives you the fonts that you can use on the web. Google Web Fonts is free, which is why we start off with that. And self-hosted fonts is just fonts that you have on your own server that you're hosting yourself. And so we do that by adding that to the CSS code. And so what I want to do today for our demonstration is I want to do a Halloween party invitation. So we'll do a fun little site today. I just want a little one-page site that just has a Halloween party invitation. I've already got my HTML skeleton up here. I've got a CSS file. I don't have any CSS in it yet. Let's go ahead and add some CSS rules. Let's go ahead and just build up the base site before we start worrying about changing font. All right, so I'm gonna reset all rules to box sizing border box. I'm gonna do margin 0 pixels, padding 0 pixels. So I'm just gonna do some reset code here. So now I'm in full control of margin and padding on everything. I'm going to do something fairly different here than what we normally do, right? I want to make this a specific type of site. So what I want to kind of do here, since this is an invitation, I want to have like the screen. And then I want to put like a little box in the middle of the screen. And that box in the middle of the screen is going to be our invitation. So instead of doing like the standard site type that we normally do, I want to do this instead. So in order to do that, I need to focus my body. I need to set a full size width and height on it. So width would be 100 viewport width. Height would be 100 viewport height. I'm going to give it a background color. Since this is a Halloween party invitation, I'm going to make it an orange, so let's go with CC7700. Sort of a darkish orange. And I'm going to want to display grid. Display grid. So we're going to be using a grid method here to center our box in the middle of the page. So we're going to justify items, center, and we're going to align items, center. So justify items and align items are properties of a CSS grid. They discuss how the item will be aligned in the cell. And so basically we're going to put one item in one cell, which encompasses the whole page. And so it's just going to center it up right in the middle of the page. So let's put it in there. And let's go in here and add our main to our CSS. That's going to be a background color of white. We're going to give it a min width of, let's say, 400 pixels. And a width of, let's say, 20 viewport width. So it'll be at least 400 pixels wide. But it'll be 20% of the width of the viewport if it is bigger than that. And we might even want to make that a little bit bigger. We want to make that something like 30 or 35 viewport. Because 20 viewport width on a 1920 is not quite 400, right? So let's go with like 35. And I'm going to set an aspect ratio to make that a square. So aspect ratio is going to be 1:1. Right, so now I should have an orange background site. Let's go live here. I have an orange background site with a square in the middle of it. Right, just dead center. And if I resize this window, I'm going to resize accordingly until it hits 400 pixels. And it's just going to stay 400 pixels. And we can see there, it just keeps it right in the middle of our document. Pretty cool. Let's also add a box shadow to that while we're adding here. Do a box shadow. Let's see here. I always forget how to do box shadow. I have to remember. I want this one to be like 0 offset top and bottom, 0 offset left and right, like 5 pixels of blur, and 525252. All right, so now we just have a little bit of box blur here. Behind our box here. That just pops it off the page just a little. So let's add some text here. We're going to add an H1. It's going to say Halloween party. We're going to add an H2 here. It's going to say maybe October 31st. And we're going to add a paragraph here. So let's add a paragraph. I'm going to use Emmet here and see if we can get this quick. So we've put just 5 lines of lorem ipsum inside of a paragraph tag. 5 lines might be too much, but we'll handle it with our fonts, right? And dealing with our font, because that probably is too much. So let's take off like. Let's get rid of that first sentence, and we'll deal with that. Right, so we can see here, there's no padding on that main section, right, because we reset it. Let's add a little bit of padding back there. Padding. And let's make it like 0.6 em. And that's good, right? We'll go from there. And so this is what this looks like now, right? Which isn't great. So what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to use some different types of fonts to make this look a little bit better. Right? And we know about the web-safe fonts, right? Things like Tahoma, Arial, Helvetica, Times New Roman, Comic Sans. But they're all kind of boring, right? So if we get into something a little bit different, one of the things we might want to use is Google Web Fonts. So let's check out some Google Web Fonts. This is the Google Web Font site. It's fonts.google.com. You can see they have a bunch of different types of fonts here that you can look at and use. Of all sorts of different types. You can select filters to try to pick a certain type of font. Right, we have classifications here for different types of fonts. So if we want a handwriting font here, we can select that. We can select display fonts or monospace font, serif, slab serif, or sans serif fonts. We're going to look at some of the sans serif fonts. And I really just want a basic font, right? I want a basic, nice font that's a little bit different, that might help us out with the amount of text we have in that text box, right? Because, you know, if we look at our invitation here, there's a lot of text here. So I kind of like this Roboto condensed. Simple font, it's condensed so the letters are tighter together. We can use letter spacing to space them out a little bit to our liking. All right, so let's click that font. And so we get the option here to download the family, but that's not what I want to do with it. Right, I can download this, install it on my local computer, and use it there. What I actually want to do is I want to go into this part where I'm looking at the different font faces. I want to pick the ones I want to use, and I want to add it with this plus sign here. I'm going to hit that plus sign. And we can see it actually gives me the CSS rules to use it straight from Google. So what I want to do is I want to go right here where it says use on the web. I want to switch from link. I mean, we could use link and then link it in the CSS in the head of our document with the other CSS files. Well, I like to use the import instead. And so I'm going to use this @import here. I'm going to copy and paste it. It has style tags with it. You don't need to grab those style tags. I'm going to paste that @import rule at the top of my document. And it actually looks like it still has some from another project here that I did. So I'm actually going to get rid of that other family there. But that does go to show you that you can add multiple fonts to a singular space and import them. Yeah, so I have, in previous projects, I'd use this IBM Plex Mono and this Ayala 1. So, the more you add, the more you can add to a project. It also gives you the CSS font family rules that you can just copy and paste. It puts the Roboto condensed name in there, and it adds a backup, which to just regular sans serif. So if I wanted to take my paragraph here and make it that font, maybe I want to make H2 that font as well. I can write some rules here. H2, comma, paragraph. And there's my font family rule. So now let's take a look at how that looks. Looks really different, right? Looks really different. But we can see it just put the font on my site. Right? Easy. No problem. Now I might want to do something like I might want to specify my H2 rules. Text align center there. Since we have some longer lines of text here, I might want to put some more line spacing between these lines. Maybe a little margin bottom here on my H2. Let's add a little margin bottom. Maybe like 0.6 em. And then on my paragraph, I will add some line height rules. Line height rules. And so the line height rule is going to determine the height of my line. Right? Seems pretty simple, and that's what's going to give me some more spacing in between my lines. So what if I said something like maybe 1.6 em? Let's see what that looks like. Okay, looks pretty good, right? You can see changing the line height changed the spacing between my lines. It is a little bit bigger now. Something that I might want to do with these items is change this from using viewport height and viewport width to maybe vmin and vmax, right? So maybe I would say like 2 vmax. There, so if somebody's, say, reading it on a phone, it might be a little bit different. Maybe even something smaller like 1.25 vmax. Right, this is something that you might have to tweak a little bit. Yeah, I want it a little bit bigger than that. But that is also going to, since my box gets bigger at bigger sizes, that's going to give you a little more line height at the bigger sizes where the lines will be longer, right? So we said that we want more spacing between lines at times when our lines are longer. So this actually gives us that possibility. Which is pretty cool. I might want to take my H2 and give it a font size that is maybe viewport related. I might also want to put that into, say, media queries. Right, we won't spend much time on this just because, this is supposed to be more about using the web fonts themselves instead of, playing around with values and such. Vmin, Vmax, media queries, making it responsive and so on and so forth. So there's that. We might have to edit that just a little bit, right? But we will. But I want to focus on this Halloween party here. So let's use a font for that. That'll be in our project, a self-hosted font. And so let's go to Defont here. You can use basically any free font, Defont, Font Squirrel, Lost Type Co-op. Anything that's free for like personal use. If it's commercial use, you want to buy it. All right. But I'm going to go over here and I'm going to click on Halloween. And I'm going to look through here and I'm going to find a cool font. All right, and I saw one that I liked earlier, and I think, if I find it here, I will grab it and use it. This one, Ghost Phobia. Right, so we can see that Ghost Phobia here is very different than a regular font. I want to download this font. So if we open that in my downloads folder and we unzip it, let's see, I have an OTF font and I have a TTF font. Now, these fonts won't work on the web by default. What I want is a WOFF or WOFF2. This, however, is okay. Right, because there are ways that we can convert them. So if we look at these and we go in here into this font and I double click one of these fonts, we can actually see that sort of font chart or that documentation guide that we saw earlier with that manual. Right, it's right here, so we can see how all the letters look and how they all work together. And I like this, right? So I'm going to use it. But I said we can't use an OTF or a TTF, so we need to use a WOFF. So how are we going to do that? Well, we need a site like FontSpace's web font generator right here. And I'll share this with you when I upload the recording. So I'm going to click to upload my file. I'm going to get my file here in my downloads. I'm going to use the OTF. And it's going to pretty quickly get that ready into a WOFF that I can use. Download. Now we can open and unzip that zip folder. And now you can see here that it's given me, well, let's extract it again. The problem with pzip is it doesn't always work. There's our there's our web font folder with our Ghost Phobia WAF in it. I'm going to rename this, and I'm just going to just put that uppercase G to a lowercase. And I'm just going to drag it out of this folder into my project folder in VS Code. I'm just going to drag it right into there. So now I have ghostphobia.waf in my project folder. And so now I can create an @ rule that is an @font-face. I actually don't need curly braces for that. @font-face. Wait a minute, I do need curly braces for that. What am I saying? I need curly braces for that because I have to define two properties here. I have to define the font family. And in this case, right, like when we look at these other fonts that we see, the font family's been defined elsewhere. So we're just putting that in there. But in this case, we're defining the font family name. So what we put here will be what we call it when we refer to the font family in other places. So in this case, we might call it Ghosts. We also want the source. And that source, or SRC, is going to point to a URL. And that URL is going to be where that font file is located. So in this case, since it's in the same project directory, I can just add the file name ghostphobia.waf. So now I'm ready to use it, right? It knows what I'm calling it, and it knows where it's at. So if I add a rule here for my H1 and say font-family, did I say uppercase ghost or lowercase? All lowercase. Ghost. That's going to reference that font file. And we're going to get it there. Now I do want this to be a little bit bigger, not completely bigger, right? Let's say font-weight normal. Let's say text align center. Let's say font size. Let's say something like 3M. All right, let's just try that out, see what it looks like. Looks pretty good to me. All right, I'm going to cut another sentence off of my lorem ipsum here, just to give myself some more working room. I might even do it with 2 more sentences here, just to give myself some more working room. Because I want to add a little bit of margin to the bottom of that, right? So let's add a little bit of margin, bottom. Maybe something like, let's see, what did we use on the H2? 0.6M, so let's split that in half and use 0.3M. And we have our font here, which is pretty cool. Right, we can see that Ghost Phobia works fine, right? We're not used to seeing a font that looks like that on the web, but we can highlight it and use it and copy and paste it. Now, one of the things that I like to do is I like to use emojis, right? And a lot of you have probably seen me go into like some HTML before and pop like an emoji in there. And that's fine, right? But there are some problems there, right? One is that, well, emojis look different on different devices. So I might want something that looks consistent. And 2, it might not match the voice of what I'm trying to get across. So what I might want to do instead is use a glyph font that is a font of pictures to add some emoji-like context to my document. We can do that pretty easily, actually. And so we're basically going to follow the exact same process we just followed. We're going to go to the font. And they actually have these sort of glyph type fonts in here, right? Like this one, Halloween Dreams Doodle is one, right? It's a glyph font. Here's one, Woodcutter Halloween, Halloween Bell. And you just want to find one that, you know, kind of matches your vibe. Right? I think I want to use this Halloween dingbat clip art here. Gives me a lot of different, gives me some different options. You know, the jack-o'-lantern there on Q is a lot creepier than the emoji jack-o'-lantern. So it, gives off a bit of a different vibe. Let's download this font. And basically follow that same process we just did again, right? So we're going to extract that from the folder. We're going to take that and we're going to bring that into our web font generator. So I'm going to take my font out of that folder, put it in there, download the web font kit. We can actually use that. Okay. I'm going to rename this font just so it'll be something easy to refer to later. We call it Halloween -clip .waf. And I'm going to drag it into my project. Like so. We're going to add another font face rule for it. So at font-face. Font family, we'll call this one clip art. And the source is URL HalloweenClip.waf. Now, for those of you who are also taking the Web 215 class, in there you will have seen me use befores and afters. And that's what I use for these. Right? Because we could just sort of put them in a span, put them in line, add the font family rule to the span, and it would work. But then if someone needed a screen reader to read their project or to read the website for them, when it got to this one point, it would just read a random letter or a random string of letters, and it would be confused, right? So instead I use before and afters, because those are in the CSS, so they're not rendered as actual text. So in this case, I'm going to put my content as Q. So if we look at it now, we'll see that there's a letter Q right here at the start of Halloween party. I can't highlight it because it's added via CSS, so it's not an actual editable piece of type. So if I want to change my font family to clip art, then it changes it to that little spooky pumpkin that we looked at. And I can add spaces and things like that in here, right? To space it out. I can also do the same thing for the after by comma, H1, after. Right, so now I have it before and after the H1. We'll put a little space before so it handles that. And we can even change the color, right? So I want to make the color of this maybe to match the orange of the background. So I'm going to go hashtag CC7700. And there we have our Halloween party invitation using a live text from a self-hosted font, a before and after of a self-hosted glyph font, and an example of using Google Web Fonts to create a changed font on our page. So we'll stop here. This is all I wanted to do, and we've hit 50 minutes, so that's plenty. While I'm holding for questions here, I'll push this up to GitHub. So when you get the recording, you will get the GitHub with all the code. You will get the link to the live site of this. I'll put it on Google. I'll put it on GitHub pages as well, so you can see it in action over there. I will send you the link to this web font generator. And I will send you the link to the Google Fonts homepage so you can have that. So that's 4 links that I'll be sending you when I send you this recording. Since we're not seeing any questions right now, we'll go ahead and wrap up here. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.